Thanks for coming on this Friday afternoon. I'd like to talk about some research that I've been doing as a sort of side project over the last 18 months. Some of the work is based on some earlier work that was done by Sarah Green, who is a former PhD student at Manchester. She was a former student of James Vernon, who unfortunately had been ill for quite some time. I took her out for a while, over for a while, but I used the basis of some of her research for this paper. Sarah unfortunately died quite a while ago, and her husband invited me over to their house when he was clearing out her office. So I rescued her stuff and thought, what a shame that her fantastic research project, which was on banknote forgery and forgers, never saw the light of day. So this has taken quite a different direction because, of course, I spotted shopkeepers and got very excited about them, as I'm wont to do. But it's still, at the root of it is her idea about this growth of forgery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So in November 1817, the Times reported a case brought before the Queen's Square Magistrates Court in Westminster concerning banknote forgery. In custody was a respectable-looking man named Stephen Clifton, who had been arrested for allegedly passing a counterfeit Bank of England note. William Green, a grocer and tea dealer who traded on Berry Street in Chelsea, reported that on the previous Monday night, Clifton came to his shop alone and asked for a £1/4 of tea, which King duly weighed and wrapped in paper before accepting a £1 note in payment. According to King, he then went immediately into his parlour, which adjoins the shop, with the note in his hand, where his wife, who had heard what passed, reproached him for giving change for a note to an entire stranger. King claims to have answered that it appeared to be a good one, for it had the watermark. But hearing a whistle outside, this made him head into the street. According to King, he had not gone far before he heard another whistle not far from him, and walking in the direction from which the sound came, he heard the prisoner, by the light of a window, cross the street and go up to two men on the other side. One of these men was said to have come out of the neighbouring shop of the greengrocer, Mr. Shaw. King claimed that he passed the men as near he could and heard one of them say, "Well, we have done them cleverly." At that point, King described himself as pretty well convinced how the matter was. Quickly checking with Mr. Shaw's shopman and hearing that he too had just exchanged a £1/4 of tea for a £1 note, King was said to have told him, "It is a forged one, you may rely on it." King and Skinner pursued all three men, holding Clifton until a constable arrived, whilst the other two escaped. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a picture that I've used on the front of my latest book. This is not a plug because you can read the book on open access for free, although it would make a fantastic Christmas present if you were so minded. This is the inside of a snuff shop in London to give you a sense of where the crimes that I'm going to talk about today, or alleged crimes, were taking place. Although Stephen Clifton was sentenced to 14 years transportation for his crime, he and his accomplices were not the only ones who took risks during this episode. Selling to strangers was a significant occupational hazard for retailers in late Georgian Britain, but one that was very hard to avoid. Nowhere were the dangers greater than in larger towns and cities where shopkeepers were dependent on a steady stream of passing trade composed of a significant number of customers that they did not know. The obvious risks of offering credit to unfamiliar buyers could be avoided, at least in theory, by restricting them to ready money purchases. But the widespread problem of forgery meant that the coins and banknotes exchanged for goods and services could themselves be unreliable. This was especially true when new lower denomination notes were issued between 1797 and 1821, an innovation that was accompanied by an upsurge in counterfeiting and the crime of uttering. Uttering is presenting a note for payment that an individual knew to be counterfeit with the intent to defraud. What a lot of these people did, in fact, everyone will talk about today, was take a relatively high denomination note to pay for a very low priced item to get the change, which was real, genuine money. If a forged note was received from a stranger, there was limited chance of seeking recompense. Traders thus risked financial loss by accepting a counterfeit. But even more dangerous was the possibility that if they tried to pass it on themselves, they too could be accused of uttering. However, if traders refused to accept banknotes and other forms of legal tender, such as coins and bills of exchange, which were also prone to forgery, then they would lose vital custom. Tradesmen and women across Britain thus faced an increasingly tricky dilemma, as growing urban populations meant that they dealt with rising numbers of strangers in their day-to-day business whose trustworthiness and personal credit was extremely hard to gauge, at the same time that banknote forgery was on the increase. The decisions that retailers made about both banknotes and the individuals who presented them for payment in this context illustrates some of the ways that town dwellers sought to navigate the rising anonymity of urban society in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, not surprisingly, I looked a lot when I was thinking about this project at trust. Many of you will be familiar, especially with the work of people like Craig Muldrew, those of you who are early modernist, who suggested that trust or credit was a crucial factor in many of the economic transactions and credit networks of early modern England, and specifically amongst smaller communities in which one's personal or household credit and reputation rested on the direct cooperation of neighbours or known associates as part of a dense network of cooperation and obligation. This understanding of the role of trust draws on the work of sociologists investigating its functional properties. These scholars commonly argue that there was a transition from pre-modern to modern societies, in part defined by the growth of towns and cities, which brought about changes in the way trust operated. In particular, they identify a shift from particularistic, or what they call thick, forms of trust, embedded in highly personal relationships, such as network of family, friends, neighbours, to more thin, social or generalised forms of trust that involve a greater number of ties and less dense relations, and which eventually became centred around institutions like banks and the abstract capacities thought to reside within them, like expertise. Of course, the development of modern societies, in which complex and stable social, political and economic organisations such as banks, companies, monetary systems and bureaucratic organisations are broadly trusted by citizens, although it's funny talking about that in the age of COVID, in part by virtue of their possession of expert systems of knowledge, cannot appear overnight, whilst the move from pre-modern forms of society, where trust is based largely on interpersonal relations in smaller communities, to modern urban societies functioning according to new forms of social trust, will necessarily be both slow and uneven. At the same time that this move is supposedly happening, a paucity of efficient regulatory control, police and courts, means that the confidence that individuals might have in systems and bodies to police transgressions of trust and uphold standards can be partly or wholly absent. So during a period of transformation, as society becomes more heterogeneous and anonymous, interpersonal trust is described as increasingly difficult to generate, since trusting in those about who one knows little is inherently risky. Now, such developments have been depicted by sociologists, economists and others as particularly problematic for those involved in commerce, since low levels of social trust are seen as an obstacle to economic activity. Yet as the economy grew and commercial transactions proliferated during the 18th and 19th centuries, it seems unlikely that rising anonymity acted as a major brake on retailing. Though the literature on trust suggests the rise in anonymity associated with urban growth ushered in more abstract and impersonal economic and social relations, Margot Finn has demonstrated that supposedly pre-modern forms of credit relations remain commonplace and widespread in England into the 19th century. So this paper seeks to test some of these assumptions about social and economic relations in the late 18th and early 19th century by exploring the ways in which urban anonymity was negotiated by those making daily commercial transactions with strangers in what has been described as the chaos and confusion of the early industrial city. I'm going to do it by focusing on Britain's largest and arguably most impersonal urban centre, during the period when retailers appear to have been subject to increasing risks in their day-to-day business, including the particular threat posed by the rise of banknote forgery. Now, though a model of thick trust certainly fits neatly into an explanation of economic relations in the smaller towns of early modern England, the supposed shift to a society defined increasingly by thin forms of trust appears, I think, less compelling when examining the practices of late 18th and early 19th century London traders, who notably never used the terms trust or distrust in any of the sources that I've looked at and that I'm going to talk to you about today. You'll be relieved to know I'm going to talk to you about a lot more examples and less theory as I go on. Despite living in a city that bore many of the hallmarks of modernity in terms of population size, anonymity, and the increasingly effective policing of banknote fraud, the capital shopkeepers appear to have relied on decision-making processes that can appear, at least at first sight, poorly suited to the context of a society largely composed of broader, shallower networks of trust. Indeed, by consistently placing their faith in the local and the personal, even when the evidence presented to them seems extremely shaky, and by relying on the knowledge or opinion provided by family and neighbours over and above that imparted by experts or institutions, the behaviour of the capital's tradesmen and women can appear, superficially at least, as outdated and risky. But rather than viewing the traders in this study as collectively misguided about the urban society in which they conducted their daily financial transactions and blind to the levels of risk to which they exposed themselves, I think a close examination of their conduct suggests a rather different reading, and one that largely dispenses with the need to use trust as an interpretive model. But the reason I've talked about it so much is because everybody says it must be about trust. We can think more about that. Instead, I think we can explain the behaviour of tradesmen and women as guided by alternative rationales, including individual calculation based on past and shared experience, a particular understanding of locality, and the wider context of increasingly effective institutional enforcement. In examining what happens to human interaction and social organisation during one phase of the modern era, I want to question not just the utility of using trust as an explanatory concept in economic transactions, but also the model of historical change on which many studies of trust and modernity are themselves based. In doing so, and in common with other studies, I suggest that the process of social and economic change that accompanied the growth of towns did not involve traditional pre-modern society neatly giving way to modernity, but was almost certainly more complex and contradictory, as historians are always wont to say, of course. So the study I'm going to talk to you about, exploring traders' responses to banknote forgery and risk in the Georgian period, is largely based on court records and newspapers. I'm focusing on the period 1797, when the Bank Restriction Act was passed and new banknotes began to be issued, and the suspension of the Act in 1821. I also draw on other contemporary commentaries concerning fraud, deception, and the risks to traders in the wider piece that I've been writing. Search of the Old Bailey records online found during this period for crimes relating to uttering and forgery located 96 trial reports that included 204 instances of alleged uttering taking place in the capital's shops or involving the capital's traders. Searching for similar reports in the Times identified a further 130 incidents. Cases of alleged uttering and forgery are much more poorly documented outside London, and thus, perhaps for the first time in my historical career, I have been forced to leave the north of England and study my hometown. Now, we can talk later, if people want to, about the reason for the counterfeiting crisis of 1797 to 1821. But it was down to a shortage of gold during the wars against revolutionary France. There had always been a shortage of specie, especially in the north of England, actually, before that, but it became particularly acute. As a response, the Bank of England produced new lower denomination notes. Could I have the next, actually move through a couple of slides? Yes, just some insides of shops. There's another shop. Yeah, and the next one, thank you. Here's an example of a £1 note. Now, this is printed in black with a signature and date and a number provided by a clerk. And even some of the most honest amongst you in the audience tonight might think that you too could probably forge one of these notes. It was not difficult at all. And it was in fact the forgery crisis around this period that led to people in the 19th century inventing all the swirls and patterns that make banknotes much more difficult to forge later on. So here's an example of a £1 note from 1808 from the British Museum. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a forged note. Can I point out that the forged stamps were put on by the bank when this was discovered to be a forgery? They were not there on the original. If you look at the next slide, please. Here's an example of these two notes together, so you can look at them. I know the paper is much more yellow on the top one, and it has forged stamped on it. But if you can imagine removing the forged, you can see how easy it was to fake these and how often, and it's not surprising how often people got away with these kinds of deceptions. The trial of Thomas Edwards, a journeyman silversmith from London, who was accused of uttering in 1804, shows both the dangers of forged notes to the unwary and the ease with which they could be passed to other apparently unwitting traders. Edwards was accused of knowingly passing forged £2 notes to several retailers. His deposition at the time of his arrest stated that he had received the notes from a man he met in Clerkenwell as payment for the manufacture of several silver boxes. Edwards freely admitted using them to buy goods in a number of shops. I paid one at a pork shop in Flea Market. I paid one at Jenkins, a pawnbroker in Red Cross Street, where I redeemed some silver boxes last week. At the beginning, I paid one to redeem 6 silver teaspoons in Shoreditch. 2 ladies keep the shop, left-hand side, near the bottom of Old Street. About 3 weeks ago today, I paid another in Holborn, Middle Row, near Brook Street, bought a pair of shoes and gaiters. According to his account, it was not until he went into the shop of a Mr. Spinks in Barbican and presented one of the notes for payment that he was told it was a bad one. Edward's defence rested on his lack of guilty knowledge. I am a young man, he claimed, and have not been taught that caution which the counsel against me seems to think I ought to be in the possession of. Similarly, when Charles Lindsay was accused of trying to pass a forged note in a butcher's shop in 1799, he claimed that the note had been taken by his wife from a customer in their own shop, which any tradesman here might do. I suppose a number of gentlemen on the jury entrust their wives in their shops. I hope they will feel for my situation. It is impossible for them to tell a good note from a bad one. Other tradesmen and women giving evidence in court were, unlike the unfortunate Edwards and Lindsay, more likely to stress that they had taken reasonable care when accepting banknotes, especially from strangers. But just how cautious individuals were expected to be and what forms of taking care were seen as reasonable was not clear-cut. Nor, of course, can we always believe traders' assertions about the levels and forms of caution that they exercised, of course. But yet, despite significant caveats about using Old Bailey court records, this does not mean that the reasons presented for retailers either instituting certain checks or claiming to have done so were random. And we know from Shelley Tickle's work on shoplifting in this period that retailers routinely expended considerable effort to enact a variety of measures to prevent theft. So though court records reveal a range of practices reflecting different ideas about what constituted reasonable care when you're taking banknotes from strangers, certain habits of behaviour or alleged behaviour stand out and are repeated again and again. From this, I would argue we can have some confidence in judging normative behaviour from the evidence of court records in this respect. Moreover, Edwards' comments remind us that caution in economic transactions was something that needed to be learned. This process of learning, especially from one's family, employers and peers, might go some way to explaining the common patterns that we see amongst tradesmen and women involved in cases of alleged uttering. One frequently remarked upon aspect of the growth of towns and rise of anonymity was the ability to assume a particular social status or to pass simply by virtue of one's dress and demeanour. 18th century historians are very common with that idea. This was something that both contemporaries and historians have remarked upon, with the phenomenon often presented as striking because of the apparently flimsy basis on which such judgments depended. Making assessments on appearance and behaviour seems to have been commonplace amongst traders accepting banknotes from strangers in my study. Yet, although James Boswell famously claimed to have been able to walk out of a London shop in 1762 in possession of a valuable sword, with the shopkeeper willing to advance him credit based solely, according to Boswell, on his external appearance and address, an important detail in this story that is less commonly recounted is that the shopkeeper also asked the stranger, Boswell, for his name and place of abode before he departed with his goods. At that time, Boswell was lodging in Downing Street, less than half a mile from the Strand where he obtained the sword. The closeness of this address would have been important. This practice of asking unfamiliar customers for a name and address was an extremely common one, as was accepting banknotes from strangers because they lived or claimed to live locally. Such was the weight attached to proximity that the witnesses in 68% of my Old Bailey sample noted that unknown customers had claimed to live near the shops where they were accused of uttering. The practice of writing a customer's name and address on the back of a banknote was commonly mentioned in court cases, with a few surviving banknotes, such as the next slide, please, displaying this practice. So there you can see it's another forged note, and on the back it has somebody's name and address. Now, people writing on the back of banknotes or noticing that other people have and adding names in a list is described a lot in the court records. You don't find many banknotes that show that sort of evidence, but that's probably for two reasons. You would only find them if they were forged banknotes like this one, because they're kept because of that piece of evidence. But in the British Museum collection of banknotes, for example, which is very extensive, annotations are not something that is attractive usually to banknote collectors, and so they tend to be clean banknotes. Supplying a name and a local address seems to have been enough to reassure a significant proportion of tradesmen and women who became embroiled in uttering cases. Thus, though John Fowler, shopman to a Mr. Jones of 7 Cow Lane, claimed to have his suspicions about a £1 note presented to him by Sarah Wiley and Anne Hayes in 1804, he reported in court that, "I agreed to take the note upon these terms if they would tell me where they lived." He claimed to have been satisfied enough to accept their note when they told him that they lived in a nearby street, asserting that he did not discover that the note was bad until a week later. Similarly, the grocer, William Tomlin, whose shop was in Tottenham Court Road, claimed that he accepted a £1 note from Mary Best, not just because he thought he recognised her as a recent customer, but also because his request for a name and address to put on the note resulted in her providing a local address. Tomlin later stated in court that place not being above half a quarter of a mile from my house, I did not scruple of taking the note at all. The ease with which an unknown customer could elicit the confidence of shopkeepers simply by convincing them that they lived locally is most clearly illustrated by the case of Harriet Skelton, who was charged with uttering at shops across London in 1818. Could you put the next slide up, please? Right, sorry, I'm not very good at maps, but I hope this is clear enough. You can see that the arrows join the place where she uttered and the place where she claimed to live in a series of uttering incidents within a very short period in 1818. Thomas Raglas, a confectioner at 198 Piccadilly, testified that Skelton entered his shop to buy a 12th cake and offered him a £5 note. I asked her what address I was to put on it. She gave me the name of Moore, 29 Berry Street, St James's. No doubt to test her, Raglas claimed, I told her I knew a person of the name Moore at number 5 and asked her if she'd not made a mistake. She said no, she lived at number 29 Berry Street and repeated the name and number several times over. Such apparent certainty on her part seems to be enough to convince Raglas, who completed the transaction. Another confectioner, Richard Sewell of Titchfield Street, reported a similar story, but this time with Skelton supplying a different name and address. He described her presenting a £5 banknote for payment for 12th cake again, which she was obviously fond of. Before I gave her change, he claimed, I asked her to favour me with her address. She gave me the name of Wise, Golden Square, which I immediately wrote on the note in her presence. Upon cross-examination, he stated I had no suspicion of the prisoner, though he noted I have never seen her before. Similar story was repeated in all the cases you can see indicated on the map here. And when mapped out, there's quite an obvious pattern in the addresses that Skelton gave and the shops she visited, which were all about 200 to 800 metres apart, 200 to 900 yards for the older person amongst us. Not so near to be on the retailer's doorstep, but near enough to be seen as local. Skelton's pretense to live locally seems to depended on her persuasive and confident manner, and on her deciding on a false name and a local address for each of the shops she visited. She had a different name, a different address for each new shop. By convincingly locating herself within the shopkeepers' local communities, she was able to present herself as a stranger who was nevertheless a member of that community and whose person and money were therefore creditable. Almost all the court cases examined described the capital's retailers inspecting banknotes before they were accepted from strangers. This could be seen either as a standard cautionary practice on the part of shopkeepers or something that witnesses felt they could tell the court in order to demonstrate that they had exercised due care. Yet Margot Finn notes a commonplace suspicion towards paper money late into the 19th century. She quotes H.G. Wells's description of dealing with banknotes in his autobiography whilst working in a South Sea draper's shop in the early 1880s. Bank of England notes were dealt with very solemnly, he wrote in his autobiography, whilst the watermark was scrutinised carefully and the payer, after a suspicious penetrating look or so, was generally asked to write his name and address on the instrument. It's noticeable how Wells' description of how retailers dealt with banknotes echoes closely the behaviours described in the Old Bailey sample from over half a century earlier. This suggests a continuance of well-established practice. In a quarter of the instances of uttering in our sample from the earlier period, the appearance of a banknote was described as arousing suspicion, though in only a handful of examples was the reason given. In these cases, it was said to usually be triggered by visual clues. For example, a very clear 0 being added after the 1 on a £1 note to try and make it into a £10 note. Sometimes the print was described as imperfect, a watermark was missing, a clerk's signature looked flawed, or the paper was the wrong colour. Sometimes clues were haptic in nature. The grocer and oil shopkeeper Caroline Warner noted that one counterfeit note she received felt thicker than banknotes generally feel, whilst the butcher George Glover claimed that he had immediately suspected a banknote presented to him was a forgery, as he had not found all its edges smooth, rather there were 2 rough sides. As had been suggested, checking banknotes by sight and feel to detect any abnormalities was something that individuals would have to learn, either as part of a deliberate educative practice on the part of employers or simply by watching what other shopkeepers did. Yet such knowledge did not necessarily enable traders to identify counterfeits in all cases, nor did it mean that individuals would want to make decisions alone, entirely trusting their own judgment. Though some shopkeepers, like a Mr. Cobb, a grocer with a shop on Ivy Lane off Newgate Street, might have been confident in his expertise, in Cobb's case, for he had by most ruinous experience become a tolerable judge of banknotes, many did not feel themselves as skilled or as assured, and they sought assistance from others. Now, seeking assistance from others, of course, is also a way of sharing the blame if a forgery is accepted, or of demonstrating that due care had been taken. It's notable that whilst bank officials were almost always called in court to give evidence concerning the authenticity of individual banknotes, and the retailers who provided testimonies in these cases often described only realizing that they had accepted a forged note when they presented it to a bank, only very rarely did traders seem to turn to institutional advice before accepting a note. Far more frequently, expertise or opinion was sought much closer to home from an employer or a co-worker or a neighbour. This happened in 31% of the sampled cases. And it suggests not just that retailers thought that these people might help them with their decision making, but that they also realized they had to make relatively quick decisions so that they did not keep customers waiting. Witnesses in 9% of our sample described asking family or household members for their opinion. So when William Rhodes, a hosier and glover in Oxford Street, was given a £5 note, he conceived it to be a bad one, as I thought, but noted that he was not certain myself, so went upstairs to his wife, who was ill in bed, to ask for her guidance. It was even more common to ask the opinion of neighbours, who were described as being implicitly or explicitly consulted in 22% of the sample. Thus, Margaret Corder recalled being called into a grocer's shop that she ran with her husband, William, on Broad Street in Bloomsbury in 1804. William was described as holding a note in his hand, with the customers Sarah Wiley and Anne Hayes present, and said to have stated that he was afraid it was a bad note and he would step into Mr. Ryder's, his next door neighbour, and ask him. Similarly, a newspaper report described Sarah Sparry, who ran a bookshop with her husband John on Rosamond Street in Clerkenwell, asking first the opinion of her husband and then her neighbour John Emery, landlord of the John of Jerusalem public house on their street, before rejecting the £1 note that Smith had tried to use to buy a part shoulder of mutton. Implicitly testing the validity of notes by asking a neighbouring trader to provide change in exchange for a banknote was described in a further 13% of cases. Taking a note to a nearby shop to ask for change could avoid offending a customer by declaring that the note was suspicious. It may also have been necessary simply because a retailer genuinely did not have enough change to complete a transaction, especially when the value of the banknote was large. Thus, when William Algar, a shoemaker from near Wapping, was offered a suspect note in 1798 from an unknown customer, Peter de Klerk, he claimed that he took it and looked at it, but he did not like the appearance of the colour of the paper, and I did not like to change it, but sent it over to a neighbour opposite me. Algar's son, who had taken the note for his father, soon returned with it unchanged. Algar Senior stated that he then sent it to another neighbour, Mr. Allybone, who would not change it either. Finally, he sent it by a servant maid to Mr. Culland in Wapping, though he was careful to make clear that he sent it to him only to inspect into it, lest he too could be charged with uttering for asking for change for a note that had already been repeatedly refused. Only when Algar's servant returned with the note did he take it to the bank for a final opinion. No doubt motivated by similar concerns, neither to accept a counterfeit note nor to be accused of trying to pass one himself, the butcher William Bunyan told the Old Bailey that after receiving a suspect note in 1799 from Charles Lindsay, he took it to the public house hard by, and I said, I think I've got a bad customer. I did not ask for change, but I asked for their judgment. Seeking the opinions of neighbours and members of one's household was surely driven in part by the ease and speed with which their views could be obtained. But in their dependence on ways of establishing authenticity in which expertise was seen not as the preserve of remote bodies and institutions, but resting instead on local networks and communities, it was another way that London retailers showed their preference for the local. Coupled with their frequent reliance on strategies that associated local residents and neighbourhood relationships with credit and trustworthiness, the capital's traders appear to have operated in ways that we more readily associate with smaller communities and earlier periods. But this reading can be challenged in several ways. Although London was home to particularly high numbers of migrants who travelled to the city from other areas of Britain and from abroad, resulting in a uniquely mobile and anonymous population, this did not necessarily make it a city of strangers. The capital had long been described as consisting of a system of neighbourhoods, each with its own character. Despite the high levels of mobility amongst its population during the long 18th century, Leonard Schwartz claims that the capital's neighbourhoods were in a permanent flux and yet were remarkably stable. Since the rich moved less often than the poor, individuals usually moved only short distances and immigrants tended to congregate in groups. He argues that an important corrective to the older views of the impersonality of large towns is that the larger a town, the more it is capable of supporting a substructure of local cultures. Approaching the issue of urbanisation somewhat differently by exploring the magical imagination in English towns during this period, Carl Bell also describes the continuance of neighbourhood communities based on local identity that was defined both spatially and culturally. Their existence, Bell suggests, does not support the argument that modernity was seen as a sudden rupture from the past on the part of those who lived through it. The continuation of local communities in London throughout the late Georgian period, which included those imagined communities that existed in the minds of inhabitants, even if they did not have a personal relationship with each member of that community, goes some way to explaining why unknown customers could gain the confidence of shopkeepers by simply claiming to be local. This is not to say that change was not apparent in the capital, so that contemporaries might also wonder at the anonymity of large towns, and London in particular, with several commentators in the early 19th century remarking that people did not know their own neighbours. But both reactions to the chaos and confusion of the early industrial city, the belief in the continuance of local communities, and the pervasive rise in anonymity can coexist. Moreover, the embrace of the local can be seen as a defence tactic in the midst of uncertainty, so that one of the impacts of the developments associated with modernity, such as rising anonymity, was to increase the value of the local and the seemingly tangible. Thus, a society in which abstract and distant institutions such as banks mattered increasingly, in part because of their expertise, was also one that simultaneously encouraged a dependence on local non-expert networks. By shedding light on their day-to-day commercial practices, this study of traders' responses to the threat of banknote forgery suggests that they experienced and imagined the city in which they lived and worked as rather less incoherent and disordered than is sometimes assumed. Instead, they relied on a series of techniques that previous experience suggested usually worked, examining banknotes and those strangers who presented them with care, relying on the expertise and opinions of neighbours and members of their households, and preferring to deal with individuals who appeared to be linked to their local community. Though such behaviour was not without risks, as the court cases which form the basis of my talk today demonstrate, it seems unlikely that losses to fraud were outweighed by the gains of additional custom, so that the tactics used by traders can be seen as firmly rational, despite being occasionally very costly. Tradesmen and women were nothing if not pragmatic. Their behaviour concerning unknown customers and the risks of banknote forgery underline this quality, but they also demonstrate the fact that many of the developments that have been associated with modernity might impact upon the lives and outlooks of ordinary Londoners in unexpected and apparently contradictory ways, some of which appear strongly linked to older forms of society. As Bernard Reiger and Martin Downton have argued, emphasising the discontinuities between modernity and its antecedents overlooks the fact that on many occasions, Britons understood modernity in terms of continuity and not exclusively in terms of fundamental rupture, so that dual models of change existed in which gradual transitions also stood alongside sudden transformations. Thank you very much.